Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're sort of going to continue down the line when looking at this concept of the self and how we get a better understanding of who we are when we focus our attention on something we call justifying our actions. To provide context as to how this topic fits in with what we examine, I want to go back to a slide, a topic that we were discussing when looking at this concept of the self. In essence, we said that forming a sense of the self was really critical in our ability to successfully present ourselves in specific ways and sort of make decisions about what we want to do in different scenarios. I also mentioned in that lecture that a critical part to understanding the self is to be able to explain why we did some of the things that we did. This concept of what we called self-justification. I referenced at that time that we would be talking about it later. Well, this is the later. This is that moment when we can take a closer look at how once we start acting, we not only use that to get a sense of who we are, but we also, in that trying to understand who we are also trying to understand why we do some of the things that we're doing. And maybe in doing so, sometimes reassess that self that we've been talking about. To understand this example a little bit better, of how we might justify our behaviors or explain things, I thought we'd start this lecture off with an activity. One that will require you to just take a few seconds to kind of sit down, pause, and think about something that I'm guessing is relatively intuitive. Some rules that you have decided to live your life by. And each of us are going to have our own separate rules, but I'm guessing that many of you have come up with these rules, or maybe you call them mantras, for a variety of different scenarios. Maybe you've got an odd one like don't steal for babies, or live each day to the fullest, or something along that line. Now they can be broad, like the live each day to the fullest example I gave, or they can be pretty narrow, like don't steal from babies. But if you could just take a minute to come up with, say, a top 5 list of rules that you live your life by. If you can't quite get to 5, 3 or 4 is perfectly fine. But a list of some things that you've decided that you're kind of aspire to and typically do live your life by. I'd like you to write down that list somewhere. And then after writing down the list, I want you to write down where you think those ideas came from. Have they been something that have been a part of your life the entire time, or have they changed or developed as a result of something? And then lastly, I want you to assess if you've ever broken any of these rules. And if you have, how frequently do you break these rules? I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. And after you're done, let's assess how this relates to self-justification. My hope is that all of you took those 5 minutes, did that pause, wrote down the list, and probably recognized that there were certain moments in your life that maybe were the catalyst for these things to be formed. My guess is that you also probably identified several times with some of these rules where your behaviors didn't necessarily align with these rules. This is that kind of gut check moment where I'm guessing you can assess if you did this or not as to kind of how often you could recall specific events if you were trying to do that where you weren't conforming to those behaviors. And what we tend to see in an in-person version of this class is almost everybody in the class has multiple examples of where they've set a rule, they've argued they live their life by it, and they haven't necessarily lived up to those rules. And this is true not only for these big things in our life, but this is also often true for other elements to who we are. And if we list our personality characteristics or justifications for why we would do things in certain situations, we oftentimes find ourselves not necessarily conforming or matching up with those things that we usually use to assess who we are. And this might lead you to ask, well, why? Why are there these inconsistencies in our behavior from situation to situation? And this brings us back to really what social psychology is all about. As I've mentioned a couple times in this class, social psychologists tend to focus their attention on these things called social influences. These constraints in the environment or things that have come up that tend to shift not only one person's behavior, but a large number of individuals' behaviors. What we see in social psychology is that the situation can be very powerful in dictating what it is we do from moment to moment. And this is something that doesn't necessarily have to involve some critical thing that's forcing people to act. Just merely switching the environment can get lots of us to do things that maybe aren't in accordance with what we see ourselves as. And if we add punishments, incentives to things, suddenly things can get significantly more complicated. A classic example would be, say, if you've decided that you are a very honest person, but let's say you're taking an exam and your instructor, while you're taking the exam, accidentally puts the answer key up on an overhead screen while you're in the midst of taking the exam and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't get that down, but please don't look." If you really need a high score in that class, then the chances of punishment or that teacher catching you low, that might be extremely enticing in that moment to just have a peek or two on a few questions that you find extremely hard. The more incentives added on, the more pressure there is. Let's say that test really matters for your final grade, or maybe it will be a huge determinant of your success after you're done. Put a lot of weight on that, and suddenly your personality might start mattering a lot less in that specific situation. If there is something that you like to do, like socialize or interact with people, and suddenly there are these huge punishments or constraints of the environment that prevent you from being able to socialize with individuals, you might again find yourself in a situation where you would expect yourself to, say, socialize or do something, but you don't act that way, and it's a byproduct of the environment. Again, social psychologists have argued for decades that we need to pay attention to social influences, things in the environment that are shifting our behaviors, because these are oftentimes very powerful players in our day-to-day actions, and sometimes they do create scenarios where our actions aren't always in alignment with our expectations of who we are, or even the rules that we've dictated we should be living our lives by. And this brings us to another really interesting question. When it happens, do we even know it's happening? Are we oftentimes just reacting to a situation without even thinking about it? Well, this brings us back to something we talked about in the social cognition lecture, this concept of automatic processing. We're going to be spending a lot of time in this module and the next module talking about this idea of conformity, how we bend our behaviors to the situation, the requests of others, or the actions of others. A lot of it, many researchers believe, kind of operates on a level below our conscious recognition. It's all automatic processing. And when we look at the automatic processing that's out there, there's a lot of beliefs that it comes in a variety of different forms. One of the players that could have an impact on some of our conformity are those mirror neurons and just our basic mimicking behaviors that we're kind of inclined to do without thought. That does tend to get us sometimes to align our behaviors, either facial or behavioral behaviors, with those around us. One of my favorite examples of this, it was actually this funny candid camera episode where it was back in the 1960s, where they would film individuals walking into an elevator with everybody standing in the elevator looking the opposite way that most people look. Right? Most of us, when we get into an elevator, turn around, face the door, and just continue to ride while looking at the door. In these clips, they'd have individuals walk into an elevator with everybody facing the back wall. And almost everybody, without question, would start facing the back wall, even though they'd never probably done that in an elevator before. These individuals sometimes looked a little confused. They probably did make a conscious decision to do this, but there's lots of other more subtle examples where people are moving in a specific way or looking at a specific thing or making a specific face where we automatically follow those behaviors. And it's not until after we've started doing it, or even after we've maybe done it, that we recognize that we're engaging in this mirroring activity, or sometimes we maybe call it mimicking when we're talking about the functions or the actions that people are committing. This is something that also can be enhanced when simple requests or other things are put forth. There was actually a famous historical figure in the United States that studied something similar to this, and we nowadays call it the Ben Franklin effect, where Benjamin Franklin was actually able to discover that oftentimes he could get people that didn't like him or didn't like some of his ideas to begin liking him, to follow along with some of his requests by doing something odd, and that's asking them to do something for him. A classic example that he would often cite was a situation where he wanted a fellow politician to go along with a piece of legislation that he was trying to push. So instead of asking this person to help him with the legislation, something he was certain this person was not going to do because they were not necessarily friends, he decided to ask this individual to loan him a book from this library, this private library this individual was a part of. After asking for help with this book, he then proceeded to ask for another thing, a little bit bigger than the previous one, but still mild to an extent. And he continued, he persisted to ask for thing after thing from this other politician or legislator. And eventually, when this vote for this piece of legislation that he was interested in came up, he asked this person to go along with him. And as a result of the fact that this person had continually given Franklin thing after thing, he went along with this new request. And it sort of seems counterintuitive. Right? One would think that essentially as people start taking things from you, you start assessing this balance and maybe do decide in this case that you're going to pull away. But what Franklin argued, and others seem to have confirmed, is that sometimes when somebody is asking more and more of us, we oddly enough are thinking more and more about them and liking them more and more as we continue to do favor after favor for them. This has also been paired with more recent studies that have shown that if you give justifications behind the requests, this bending to the will of others and this kind of decision that this is something that you should be doing and you want to be doing becomes enhanced even more. I couldn't find the exact citation for this, but one of my favorite studies I learned about as a graduate student was a study where individuals were kind of unknowingly put in an experiment where they would stand in line for a copier, something that's very common at many schools where you've got multiple faculty members and students trying to make copies at any given time. And the researchers involved in this study would go in front of the line and make different requests to get to the front of the line instead of having to stand in the back. Some would just walk in front and hope that nobody would yell at them. Others would ask if they could get into the front without giving any explanation. Others would ask if they could get in the front with giving an explanation that pertained exactly to what was going on. And then others would ask to get in the front and give some just random explanation, but provide an explanation nonetheless. And what they found in this study was that those that snuck to the front of the line without giving a reason didn't often succeed in being able to make copies as other people were waiting. Those that snuck to the front of the line and asked did have a slightly better chance of getting to that front and staying there. But those that gave a reason, regardless of what that reason was, were significantly more likely to be able to jump in front of that line and get their copies done before everybody else. And this again really highlights how oftentimes we can change our behaviors, conform to situations in ways that maybe we wouldn't anticipate while looking at from the outside. And if we're looking for why this is happening, many social psychologists have argued that this is happening almost at a subconscious level, even though I guess many social psychologists wouldn't like to use that exact phrase of subconscious. It's definitely automatic, is what they're implying. It's very tough for us, if the right scenario comes about, to be able to resist these kind of inclinations, these tendencies all of us have to bend to certain social contexts and social situations. And this brings us to a really interesting question. If we do find ourselves in these situations where we've conformed to a request or we've been led to do something that doesn't align with our beliefs, what's the end consequence? What's the thing that happens as a result of this new mismatch? And this was something that was explored way back in 1957 by a researcher named Leon Festinger. What he did in his study was he invited college students to come in and participate in what I believe he described as a spatial reasoning activity. I mean, participants would come into this study. They would stand in front of this gigantic wheel-looking device that had multiple wheels connected to each other, much like you see in this slide here. And they would be asked to turn these wheels in some sequential order. And his argument was, as people were participating, that he was measuring things like how fast they did things, the mechanics of their movement, how essentially they were able to do this relatively simple but repetitive task for an extended period of time. And his apparatus that he set up was not necessarily designed to measure anything relating to hand-eye coordination. It was specifically designed to be a ridiculously boring, tedious task. I'm guessing many of you could imagine sitting in front of these wheels for an hour, spinning them, and getting yourself to a point where you were frustrated, bored, and just wanted to get out. That was Festinger's goal, essentially, in the first part of his experiment. But what he was really interested in happened after he instilled this boredom or frustration in his students. After the experiment would end, he'd pay the participants one of two amounts. Some of the participants in this 1957 study got $1, which was actually a moderate amount of money, but nothing to necessarily celebrate for an hour's worth of work in 1957. Another collection of individuals in this activity got $20 for participating in this hour-long project. It'd be the equivalence of you getting, say, $100 to participate in a study at your school. Something that would definitely not necessarily change the lives of these individuals, but be notable. Something that would be kind of exciting for people who got that payment. He didn't tell people, here's $1, others got 20, or here's 20, others just got 1. He would just pay them amount for their participation. And then, before they would leave, he'd stop them and ask them to do him a quick favor, something that almost everybody agreed to because of some of the reasons we talked about before. He'd tell these individuals that his lab had detected that motivation levels during this experiment were sort of low, and that people weren't necessarily putting in efforts that could help them with their data. So we asked these individuals that had just gotten their pay, just finished the experiment, and remember, were probably bored out of their mind for an hour while they were doing it, to actually walk the next participant that was about to arrive for the study through the experiment, show them what they needed to do, and when describing it, try to do it in a way that made it look or sound like it was exciting. Now again, because most of us just will do that when asked, almost every participant in the study agreed to it, and then did describe the experiment to the next person that arrived in a way that seemed excited. Now, they didn't know that the next person that they were explaining the experiment to was a Confederate, and they didn't really care what that person was learning from the other individual. They just were looking at whether or not these people were doing it in earnest. And for everybody that was acting in earnest in these explanations, which was, again, the vast majority of Festinger's participants, he then pulled them aside after they had explained the study to the other person and said, just real quickly, one last question. It looks like you actually enjoyed the experiment based on the way you described it to the other individual. He said, is that the case? Could you tell us if you had a good time? And to Festinger's surprise, and many other individuals' surprises when they read this report, there was a very robust effect just based on the conditions that he had created. Now, in Festinger's mind, what he had done was made people extremely bored, and through certain social constraints, he had gotten them to then talk about how fun something was to another individual. And doing this, he created something that he called cognitive dissonance, this mismatch between our behaviors and our current attitudes. And in Festinger's argument, when people experience this cognitive dissonance, they have this need, this desire to immediately get rid of it, to try to find a way to explain this mismatch behind their behaviors and their own attitudes. So if we have a choice, he said, we might, when we recognize the mismatch, just change our actions. Right? If you think of yourself as very friendly, somebody points out that you're being mean to somebody, and you have the time and the ability, maybe you just start being a little bit nicer to that individual. But in his specific experiment, he sort of got rid of that option for his participants. They had already lied to another person about how fun something was. They couldn't undo the lie because they were no longer around that person. So that led them to the other option, and that was, in his mind, to find a way to justify their behaviors. Some individuals had a pretty good justification, he argued. He had just paid them an extreme amount of money, and maybe they felt beholden to him to reciprocate after getting that large sum. And this is exactly what he found. Those that got the $20 had an ability to justify their actions, and many of them said, no, I didn't have fun. You paid me $20 and I felt like I owed you, essentially reducing or removing the cognitive dissonance and allowing them to move on. But for those that only got $1, they couldn't do that. They were still in the throes of cognitive dissonance, realizing right then and there that they had probably been bored, but were convinced to lie to somebody about how exciting something was. Manifesting your surprise, most of these individuals that have been given the dollar chose, in their attempts to reduce this cognitive dissonance, to just alter their attitudes. Most of them then went on to argue that yes, it was actually a very fun and exciting activity, spinning these wheels over and over and over again for over an hour. Essentially, Festinger argued that the pain of having cognitive dissonance greatly outweighs our insistence on having a specific attitude towards things or a belief about something. So when push comes to shove, if we're thinking our behaviors aren't aligning with what we feel or how we think, we'll just shift how we feel about something. And when Festinger published this, lots of people flocked to understand this a little bit better. The Festinger study was sort of based on our feelings about a specific situation. Do you enjoy that event or that thing? Others started to ask, well, can we change our attitudes about a topic as a whole? In fact, another researcher, just about a year later, named Judson Mills, created another situation that was very similar to that of Festinger's, where he would ask participants their feelings before coming into the lab about cheating. And then he'd have all of his participants come into this study where half of them were given a tough task where cheating didn't help them at all, and others were given a similar tough task, but one that could be easily solved if they collaborated with each other. In fact, the situational constraints made it almost impossible for these individuals to finish the task unless they did indeed cheat. And after putting people through this test, where again, most of us don't feel necessarily great about cheating to begin with, but we are forced into different situations to do things. What Mills found was that those that hadn't been forced to cheat maintained their attitudes about cheating that they had come in with into the experiment, while those that were forced to cheat, sort of regardless where they lied in their original opinions of cheating, tended to greatly shift their opinions of cheating after going through the experiment. Those that had described cheating as abhorrent, this thing that they would never do, suddenly thought of it as slightly more okay. Those that were in the middle suddenly became even more in favor of cheating under the right circumstances. And it really highlighted how we can not only, through creating cognitive dissonance, shift our attitudes about something we're experiencing at the moment, but we could potentially shift our attitudes about something that we've held in our heads as a whole for an extended period of time. This is the power of the situation, especially when the situation creates this mismatch between our attitudes and the behaviors we're displaying. Where do we find this then in real life examples? Can we see situations where people have used this creation of cognitive dissonance to change people for better or worse? A lot of this relates to a concept that many social psychologists and clinical psychologists and even people in fields like personality psychology have looked at for years, something called counter-attitudinal advocacy. It's these acts or these kind of things that people are forced to do where they're pushed intentionally to say things, react to things that are counter to their current sets of beliefs. The classic example of counter-attitudinal advocacy is in clinical work, where people who are struggling with depression are asked for an extended period of time to just try to express outwardly happiness, motivation, kind of energy levels. It's also been something that's been used in substance abuse research, where those that are craving certain drugs are encouraged to just keep telling everybody they don't want a certain drug or a certain chemical that they become addicted to. And what we tend to find in this particular approach is that even though these effects aren't absolute, numerous studies have shown that somebody with depression who's forced to kind of act happy for a couple weeks and try to express this outwardly without trying to show frustration or show that they're being forced to do it, tend to report slightly better moods as a result of doing this. There's some efficacy research that shows that this works fairly well with substance abuse issues. It's not perfect. It's certainly not a cure-all for everything, but it again highlights how impactful this cognitive dissonance can be in changing our temporary and long-term attitudes about things when we start acting in a way that isn't in accordance with how we feel. This also has been used for some less desirable things. Many cults and other groups that get people to try to shift their feelings tend to first start by asking people to do things that they admit are probably counter to how they feel. But as they do these things more and more and more, they tend to start to change their attitudes, change their perceptions, and get them more to align with what they're actually saying. We're looking for other areas where this idea of cognitive dissonance can be applied. There's numerous studies that have shown that we tend to, once we work towards something, value it more or less based on how hard it was to accomplish that thing. If you say, play a game for just a few minutes and win, even if it seemed like a very exciting game to begin with, you might value it significantly less after beating it or completing it in a very short period of time. If you engage in something that takes countless hours to be able to defeat, your appreciation for it, your value for getting to that end often shifts through each trial and tribulation you go through in your attempts to accomplish that thing. I'm guessing many of you can think of scenarios where once you've gotten through something that maybe you didn't expect to be as hard as you thought, you suddenly feel this great sense of accomplishment that you maybe didn't anticipate feeling when you got into it. This is believed to be something very closely tied to this idea of cognitive dissonance that we've been talking about. And this leads us to another really interesting question. Do we see this in other places? Can we find real-life examples where people have actually used cognitive dissonance for really extreme situations or things that seem to kind of pop up in our everyday lives? Well, a classic example that's often used when people reference cults is this very tragic incident that actually happened here in the Bay Area, a situation with a woman named Patty Hearst. If you don't know the history of Patty Hearst, I encourage you to look her up online. I'll also provide a very interesting video link that details her kidnapping by a group of individuals named the Symbionese Liberation Army. And it follows all the different things that happened to her and how she transitioned from being sort of an activist, but not necessarily an extremely outspoken individual, to somebody that became involved in a militant group of individuals that ended up getting involved in many bank robberies and actually some violent altercations throughout her time with this group. We're looking for a little bit more mild, but definitely more application-based situation where we see these things. Numerous studies in behavior modification of children have shown that creating cognitive dissonance in young kids can be very impactful. We're looking at the best way to create cognitive dissonance in a positive light for many children. It's when we look at punishment techniques and which one's best. For a long period of time, many parents thought that extreme punishments can get behaviors to change instantly, and that's probably the best effect over the long run. But numerous studies popped up over the years, the 1990s and beyond, that actually suggested that mild punishment that created cognitive dissonance might be, in the long run, much, much more effective than these extreme punishments. And most of the arguments circled around this idea that if we provided mild punishment for something, maybe a child was hitting another child or stealing something or doing something, and they were punished mildly, now, those punishments, just because of how we react to situations, will often stop the undesirable behavior on the spot. But if they're mild, it creates, to an extent, cognitive dissonance when these kids are asked to reassess why they stopped their behavior. It's one thing for a child to say, I stopped hitting my brother because my parents took away my television privileges for a week. Versus, well, I stopped hitting my brother because I had to say I was sorry and spend 2 minutes thinking about it. It's counterintuitive to an extent, but that mild punishment, if the child's asked to assess why they stopped doing it, might actually be, again, more impactful because of the cognitive dissonance that it creates. These are obviously more desirable situations, but if we're looking in our history, we've got a slew of undesirable ones that are similar to the Patty Hearst case. Well, I wouldn't say necessarily identical, but if you've ever been at any major college with frats and sororities all over the place, you might have encountered some of the atypical, odd initiation ceremonies that many of them have that are either on the surface and something that is just known or sort of happening behind the scenes. And if you encounter them, you might ask yourself, why? Why would these people subject others to these things? And why would people be subjected to this? What numerous studies have shown is that this odd thing that we often call hazing or initiations can actually have a sort of impact in a positive way on these individuals in terms of their bonds with these fraternities or sororities. Where when they're forced to do things they don't want to do and are asked why they're doing it, they start to, much like we've talked about before, value those groups significantly more. Something sort of tied to this justification effort idea I talked about before. When you have increased value or anticipation of these things being more important, you get better retention of individuals that join these groups. You get more donations years after when these individuals are kind of asked for assistance later on. It might seem weird. It might be frustrating for those of us that have seen these types of things, but there is a preponderance of evidence to suggest that these hazing ceremonies are not just an outlet for older individuals to pick on younger kids. It's actually something that's been shown to have some utility in terms of retaining people and keeping them in those groups. Please understand, I'm not advocating for hazing or anything like that. I'm just trying to give an explanation for why this is something that's persisted for so long, even though there's lots of individuals that don't like it and have been fighting very hard against it for years. And this brings us to one other area that was of great interest to early social psychologists when it came to this kind of shift that our behaviors can have when the right situation comes up. And it was focused on how motivational principles or desires could potentially be impacted by the situation. In this case, in sort of a counterintuitive way. It relates to a concept that we call the overjustification effect. And to understand the overjustification effect, we have to first parse out two main components within motivation that lots of people were looking at in the 1960s, 70s, and even beyond. These two motivational factors are what we call intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. When we're driven to do something, when we want to do something that, for all intents and purposes, seem to be internally driven. We just like it, we just want to do it, even though there's no tangible incentive. We call those things we're driven to do intrinsic motivators. If we're doing something or pursuing something because there's some reward or some outcome at the end that's really the main point for us pursuing it, we call those things extrinsic motivators. And what researchers were interested in looking at when studying the overlap between motivation and cognitive dissonance were these situations where people might have something they're already drawn to intrinsically, and then that thing gets paired with a very tangible extrinsic motivator. One of the first studies that did this was a study back in 1971 by a researcher named Deci, where children were invited to come in and participate in a coloring activity. Now, if you've ever been around young children, you probably identified that the vast majority of children like coloring just for coloring's sake. But in Deci's experiment, half of the participants were invited to come in and participate in the color activity without being given any extra incentive. The other half were told that they would get a reward for coloring for a certain period of time. After both groups, those that were told they were going to be incentivized and those that weren't, finished a short period of coloring, they were then invited to color without getting any reward later on. And what Deci found in his 1971 study was that those that were given the reward in the beginning oftentimes rejected the opportunity to color again the second time around when incentives weren't there. Where those that hadn't been given an incentive to begin with were then, when they were offered a chance to do it again, more inclined to color again the second time around. Now, others quickly ran to this and used this to understand something we call the overjustification effect. Essentially, it's this idea that when we do have something intrinsically motivating that's suddenly supplanted by an extrinsic motivator, we find those things less valuable. And Deci's research definitely seemed to highlight this. But there were also others that thought that this was an incomplete story. A trio of researchers named Lepper, Green, and Nesbitt in 1973 tried to replicate Deci's experiment to an extent, but with some twists. So in some situations, kids were told that they were going to get some type of incentive before they participated, while others were not told they were going to get an incentive. Some who were told they were going to get an incentive did not get one for coloring. Others did. And those that were told the opposite thing sometimes did get incentives, sometimes didn't. And these conditions, being told what they were going to get, getting something, being essentially a surprise or expected, had a huge impact on this overjustification effect that Deci and others had discovered just a few years before. What Lepper, Green, and Nesbitt showed was that, much like in Deci's studies, if kids thought they were going to get an incentive for coloring, and then they did, then their motivation to do it was actually lessened as a result of doing it. Exactly what Deci had found. But oddly enough, if kids did not expect an incentive, if they weren't anticipating getting paid, paid or not, or they weren't expecting to get paid and they did somehow magically get paid, their motivation was enhanced even if they got this incentive. Now, the ones that were extremely frustrated, as you might guess, were the ones that thought they were going to get paid to color, weren't, and then were offered a chance to color again. But that fact that incentives alone don't always shift our behaviors really, again, highlights this function of cognitive dissonance. Right? What many people have gone to argue when looking at these studies is that we only experience this overjustification effect if we are faced to recognize that we seem to need to get paid for something we thought we enjoyed in the first place. In the condition where kids weren't told they were going to get any incentive and they were offered to color and they continued coloring, they weren't asked or they weren't forced to kind of go through this experience of not being sure why they're doing this task. They're just doing it because it's fun, and then magically, boom, they get incentive later on. And this has been something that's been referenced in lots of real-world examples since it was discovered back in the 1970s. People have cited the kind of diminished excitement in athletics, the diminished excitement in academia is something being tied directly to the extrinsic motivators that tend to be introduced as we progress through certain things. Grades, awards, statuses suddenly start to supplant those drives that we had internally, and in doing so, it can actually diminish our drive to do things. But what many people looking at this have argued is Lepper, Greens, and Nesbitt's research, and others that have followed up with it, suggest that it doesn't have to be that way. It's the expectation that's a key player, and how we tweak things appropriately is still something we're trying to tackle in social psychology, behavioral research, developmental research, even to this day. And this brings us to kind of another topic that closely ties into this kind of change in our reactions based on all the different components that came together to either create or not create cognitive dissonance. And it brings up another topic that was actually studied before this idea of the overjustification effect we talked about in the last slide. This concept of something called post-decision dissonance. As people studied Festinger's research in the 1950s, as the Judson Mills study came out, one of the things that people asked was, when is this dissonance actually happening? Is it happening while these people are encountering it, or is it something that only occurs when they're asked to sort of assess their behaviors? What most researchers started to argue is that dissonance really only occurs once we've done something and kind of are asked to then assess why we've done the things that we do. One of the first researchers to show how impactful that this kind of moment of assessment could be was a researcher named Brehm, who had participants come in and rate a bunch of household appliances that they potentially would want to have in their house. And unbeknownst to these individuals, what Brehm and others would do is give each participant one of the household items, but they would always just give them one of the household items that was rated equally to another item. So if I said, on a scale of 1 to 20, how much do you find this blender, this chopper, this coffee grinder, whatever, all these things desirable? And you gave me 2 that just so happens to be at the exact same level. What Brehm did was gave one of those items to these individuals. And then he asked these individuals to rate their opinion of the 2 that were equal initially, not saying that these individuals had rated those 2 the exact same way. And what Brehm found was that just by being given that one thing, most people suddenly rated that appliance that they'd gotten as more desirable, as something that they actually liked more than the other thing that they could have potentially been just randomly given. I know this might seem kind of like a weird way of studying post-decision dissonance, but it led to other researchers trying to explain this even more and trying to understand the elements to post-decision dissonance that pushed us in one direction over another. One researcher, actually a trio of researchers, that looked at this idea further was a collection of individuals who actually invited college participants to come into a study. And in this study, they had to do a couple things. And as a result of their kind of completion of these small activities, they were given a poster as a reward. But they were told that if they were going to take this poster as a reward, they were required to put it up in their dorm rooms at the beginning of, I think it was their freshman year, if I recall correctly. And they were told if they got taken down, they wouldn't be able to participate in any follow-up studies, and they wouldn't contact them for anything. So it was essential that they put these posters up on the wall. Some of the participants were kind of also told that out of the posters that they were going to get to choose, they were going to get to then choose a new poster later on if they wanted to switch. Other participants were told that they would not have an option of switching the poster after they'd selected one, so that they needed to select very carefully which one they want put it on their walls. Now, the two posters that they had to choose between were not necessarily the ones that you see here, but they were sort of like that. Right? They were movie posters that were kind of benign, nothing that amazing. But, most college students like getting free stuff, so almost everybody in the study agreed to pick a poster and keep it. And then about halfway through the semester, all the participants, regardless of what they were told originally, were called and asked if they would like to switch the poster that they had. And what Wilson and all these other colleagues found was that those that were told they could switch the poster were kind of split on whether or not they stayed with the poster they had originally selected. It wasn't quite half, but a large number of them did change their mind on which poster they had chosen. Those that were told that they had to commit to their poster, that they needed to stay with it, overwhelmingly stuck with the poster they had already chosen. And this, again, highlights an interesting component to post-decision dissonance. It suggests that, again, when we make a choice, we are immediately assessing whether or not we made a choice or did something that aligns with our interpretation of ourselves. But we can sort of be okay with mismatches if our choice or actions can sort of be undone at some point later on. If we're expecting these things to be permanent, well, then we feel this immediate need to do away with the dissonance, to change our attitudes or change our opinions, justify our behaviors so we can get back to that alignment that we originally had. This study and many others like it really highlighted this need to do away with cognitive dissonance and this need to do away with it once it's brought to our attention. This concept of the situation switching us and causing us to feel different things and make sense of things in different ways is a path we're going to continue down in our next lecture. For now, we're going to kind of close up shop. We'll be ready because in our next class, we'll be visiting this topic of attitudes, and we'll be talking about a lot of things that not only align with this concept of kind of justifying ourselves, but also align with what we're going to be talking about in the next module when we talk about this concept of conformity. For today, have a great evening, great week, or whatever it is that you're at right now, and I'll hopefully see many of you very soon. Take care.